When Marilyn Monroe knocked on Dean Martin's trailer door with trembling hands, there was only one last hope left in her eyes. When Dean opened the door, what he saw wasn't Hollywood's most famous star, but a broken woman. Marilyn wet her lips and whispered slowly, "Dean, can I ask you something?" The answer Dean was about to give would change not only Marilyn's fate, but the destiny of all of Hollywood. Because the woman standing before Dean Martin at that moment wasn't just a colleague asking for help. She was a human being shattered by the system, crushed by studios, and who no longer had faith in anyone. It was April 1962, and filming for Something's Got to Give was underway at Fox Studios in Los Angeles. This film was supposed to be Marilyn Monroe's comeback project after a 2-year hiatus. Dean Martin was cast as the male lead opposite Marilyn. But from the moment filming began, everything was going wrong. Marilyn wasn't the same anymore. She'd always had issues with being late to sets, but now the situation was far more serious. She wouldn't show up for days at a time. When she did appear, she couldn't remember her lines, couldn't focus, and seemed like she was living in another world entirely. The studio executives were going insane. Every passing day saw the film's budget balloon, production delays mounting, and Marilyn's condition deteriorating further. Dean Martin tried to stay calm in the midst of this chaos. As always, he was doing his job and staying out of the drama. But he was watching Marilyn. He could see how difficult her situation was. Everyone else was blaming Marilyn, seeing her as the source of the problem and treating her like a pariah. But Dean saw something different. He saw a woman drowning, and no one was throwing her a lifeline. The breaking point came on May 17, 1962. Marilyn hadn't shown up to set for 3 consecutive days. The director, George Cukor, was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The producers were in emergency meetings, discussing whether to fire Marilyn and replace her with another actress. The entire cast and crew were on edge, knowing that their jobs depended on this film's completion. That's when Marilyn finally appeared. But she wasn't there to work. She walked past everyone on set, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the barely concealed anger, and headed straight for Dean Martin's trailer. She knocked 3 times, softly, almost hesitantly. Dean was inside, reviewing his lines for the day's scenes. He'd been in Hollywood long enough to recognize the sound of desperation in someone's knock. When he opened the door and saw Marilyn standing there, he immediately knew this wasn't a casual visit. Marilyn's makeup was smudged, her famous platinum blonde hair was disheveled, and her eyes held a kind of pain that went deeper than any professional frustration. "Dean," she said quietly, "can I come in? I need to talk to someone who won't judge me." Dean stepped aside without a word, gesturing for her to enter. Marilyn walked into the trailer and sat down heavily on the small couch, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Dean closed the door and turned to face her, his expression neutral but attentive. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, they could hear the hustle and bustle of a film set in crisis. Assistants running around, phones ringing, urgent conversations about schedules and budget overruns. But inside Dean's trailer, there was just silence and the sound of Marilyn trying to gather her courage. Finally, Marilyn looked up at Dean. "They're going to fire me, aren't they?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. She already knew the answer. Dean sat down across from her, maintaining that calm demeanor that had made him famous. "Probably," he said honestly. "The studio's losing money every day you're not working." Marilyn nodded, as if she'd expected this response. "I know I've been difficult. I know I'm causing problems. But Dean, you have to understand, I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend to be someone I'm not, day after day, year after year. I'm tired of being Marilyn Monroe." This was the moment that would change everything. Because what Marilyn said next wasn't just a professional concern or a creative difference. It was a cry for help from someone who was drowning in her own fame. "Dean, I need you to do something for me," Marilyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they fire me, and I know they will, I need you to walk away from this project too. I need someone, just one person in this industry, to show that they won't be part of destroying someone. Will you do that for me?" The request hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Marilyn was asking Dean to sacrifice his own career, his own paycheck, his own professional relationships, for her. In 1962, walking away from a major studio picture was career suicide. It meant being blacklisted, being labeled as difficult, potentially never working in Hollywood again. And she was asking this of a man she barely knew outside of their professional relationship. Dean Martin looked at Marilyn Monroe sitting in his trailer, vulnerable and broken, asking for the one thing that might restore her faith in human decency. And he knew that his answer would define not just this moment, but the kind of man he was. But before Dean could respond, there was a sharp knock on the trailer door. "Mr. Martin, Mr. Martin, they need you on set immediately." It was an assistant director, and the urgency in his voice suggested that the crisis had reached a boiling point. Dean looked at Marilyn, then at the door, then back at Marilyn. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back." When Dean stepped outside, he found chaos. George Cukor was red-faced and shouting at a group of studio executives who had just arrived from their offices in downtown Los Angeles. The lead producer, David Brown, was on a phone call that was clearly not going well. The entire cast and crew were standing around, uncertain about what was happening but sensing that something major was about to change. "Dean!" Cukor called out when he saw him. "Thank God. We need to talk. Now." Dean walked over to where the director and producers were huddled. David Brown had just finished his phone call and was looking grim. "It's over," Brown said without preamble. "The studio is firing Marilyn effective immediately. We're going to recast her role and reshoot everything. Lee Remick has already been contacted and she's interested. We can have her here by next week." Dean nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "And what about me? You?" Cukor looked confused. "You're staying, of course. You've been professional throughout this entire ordeal. The studio is very happy with your work. In fact, they're talking about giving you a producer credit and a larger percentage of the profits as compensation for dealing with the situation." This was the moment. Dean Martin stood there, surrounded by Hollywood executives who were offering him more money, more power, and more status in exchange for going along with the destruction of Marilyn Monroe. It would have been the smart career move, the safe move, the move that every other actor in Hollywood would have made without a second thought. But Dean Martin wasn't every other actor. "I appreciate the offer," Dean said calmly, "but I won't be staying either." The silence that followed was deafening. David Brown stared at Dean as if he'd just declared his intention to fly to the moon. George Cukor's mouth fell open. Even the crew members who had been pretending not to listen suddenly turned to stare. "I'm sorry, what?" Brown finally managed to say. "I said I won't be staying," Dean repeated, his voice steady and clear. "If Marilyn goes, I go. My contract was to work with her. If you're replacing her, then you're changing the terms of our agreement." Cukor stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Dean, think about what you're saying. This is your career we're talking about. You walk away from this picture, and the studio will make sure you never work again. They'll spread the word that you're unreliable, difficult to work with, you'll be finished." Dean shrugged, that characteristic gesture that had become his trademark. "Then I guess I'm finished." The argument continued for another 10 minutes, with the executives trying every tactic they could think of to change Dean's mind. They offered him more money, a 3-picture deal, top billing on future projects. They threatened him with lawsuits, with being blacklisted, with professional ruin. Dean listened to it all with the same calm expression he wore when performing on stage. Finally, when they had exhausted all their arguments, Dean simply said, "Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure working with you. Send my lawyer the paperwork." And with that, he turned and walked back to his trailer, leaving behind a group of Hollywood executives who couldn't believe what had just happened. When Dean opened the trailer door, he found Marilyn exactly where he'd left her, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up at him with hopeful but fearful eyes. "So?" she asked quietly. Dean sat down across from her again. I told them I'm walking away from the picture. For a moment, Marilyn didn't react. She just stared at Dean as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Then, slowly, tears began to form in her eyes. You actually did it? She whispered. I gave them my word, Dean said simply. When someone asks for help, and it's the right thing to do, you do it. That's how I was raised. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over, and Marilyn began to cry. Not the delicate, camera-ready tears of a movie star, but the raw, painful sobs of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand up for her. But your career, she said between sobs. What they said about being blacklisted. Dean, I can't let you sacrifice everything for me. I'm not worth it. Dean Martin looked at this broken, vulnerable woman sitting in his trailer, and something inside him shifted. For years, he'd built his reputation on being cool, detached, unbothered by the drama and politics of Hollywood. He'd always stayed on the sidelines, done his job, collected his paycheck, and gone home. But seeing Marilyn in pain, seeing how the system had chewed her up and spit her out, he realized that sometimes staying on the sidelines wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to pick a side. Marilyn, he said gently, let me tell you something. I've been in this business for 15 years. I've made a lot of money. I've had a lot of success, and I've worked with a lot of people. But you know what I've learned? Success doesn't mean anything if you have to step on people to get it, and all the money in the world isn't worth selling your soul. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The studio executives in there, they think they own us. They think they can destroy someone's life and career just because they have the power to do it. They think Marilyn Monroe is expendable, just another asset on their balance sheet. But I don't see it that way. I see a talented woman who's been pushed beyond her breaking point by an industry that doesn't care about anything except profit. And if standing up for that woman means sacrificing my career, then so be it. Marilyn was crying harder now, but there was something different in her expression. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone had treated her like a human being instead of a commodity. But why? She asked through her tears. Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. Dean was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Maybe that's exactly why, he finally said. I don't have any agenda here, Marilyn. I'm not trying to sleep with you. I'm not trying to get something from you. I'm not trying to use you for publicity. I'm just a guy who sees another person in pain, and I have the power to help, so I'm helping. The simplicity of his answer seemed to affect Marilyn even more than his grand gesture. She'd spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from her, her body, her fame, her money, her endorsement, that she'd forgotten what it was like to meet someone who wanted nothing except to treat her with basic human decency. They sat in silence for a while, Marilyn crying and Dean just being present with her. Outside, the chaos continued as the studio tried to figure out how to salvage their project. But inside the trailer, there was a strange sense of peace. Finally, Marilyn wiped her eyes and looked at Dean. What happens now? She asked. Now, Dean said. You go home. You take care of yourself. You figure out what you really want to do with your life, not what the studio wants you to do. Not what your agents want you to do, but what you want to do. And you remember that there are still good people in this world, people who will stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself. Marilyn nodded, still crying, but with a different kind of tears now. These weren't tears of despair, but tears of gratitude, of relief, of hope. Dean, she said, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Dean replied. Just promise me something. Whatever happens next in your life, whatever decisions you make, remember this moment. Remember that you are worth standing up for. You are worth protecting. And you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter what anyone else tells you. 3 weeks later, the news broke in all the major trade publications. Dean Martin had walked away from Something's Got to Give, forfeiting his salary and risking his career to support Marilyn Monroe. The story sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Some people called Dean a fool, saying he'd destroyed his career for a woman who wasn't worth it. Others called him a hero, praising him for standing up to the studio system. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home on August 5, 1962, just 3 months after Dean Martin had walked away from the film to support her. The official cause of death was listed as a drug overdose, though rumors and conspiracy theories would persist for decades. When Dean heard the news, he didn't speak to reporters. He didn't make public statements. He simply attended her funeral, along with a handful of other Hollywood figures, and paid his respects to a woman who had been destroyed by the very system that had made her famous. Years later, when interviewers would ask Dean about his decision to walk away from Something's Got to Give, he would always give the same simple answer. She asked for help, so I helped her. That's what you do for people. The film was eventually completed with Lee Remick in Marilyn's role, but it was a critical and commercial failure. Dean Martin, contrary to the studio's threats, was not blacklisted. In fact, his reputation for integrity and loyalty made him more sought after than ever. Directors and producers knew that if they hired Dean Martin, they were getting not just a talented performer, but a man of principle. But for Dean, the real legacy of that moment wasn't his continued career success. It was the memory of sitting in his trailer with a broken woman who just needed someone to treat her like a human being. It was the knowledge that, when faced with a choice between his own self-interest and doing the right thing, he had chosen correctly. Marilyn Monroe died believing that there was at least one person in Hollywood who had cared about her as a person, not as a commodity. And Dean Martin lived the rest of his life knowing that he had used his power and privilege to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. In the end, that was worth more than any movie, any paycheck, or any career achievement. That was the moment Dean Martin proved that being the king of cool wasn't about never caring. It was about caring so deeply that you'd risk everything to do the right thing. The last conversation between Dean Martin and Marilyn Monroe took place in a trailer on a Hollywood studio lot, but it represented something much larger. It was a moment when human decency triumphed over corporate greed, when loyalty mattered more than money, and when one person's courage gave another person hope. And sometimes, in a world as brutal and unforgiving as Hollywood, hope is the greatest gift you can give someone. When Marilyn Monroe knocked on Dean Martin's trailer door with trembling hands, there was only one last hope left in her eyes. When Dean opened the door, what he saw wasn't Hollywood's most famous star, but a broken woman. Marilyn wet her lips and whispered slowly, "Dean, can I ask you something?" The answer Dean was about to give would change not only Marilyn's fate, but the destiny of all of Hollywood. Because the woman standing before Dean Martin at that moment wasn't just a colleague asking for help. She was a human being shattered by the system, crushed by studios, and who no longer had faith in anyone.